quick fire Q&A, because lots of questions have come in about the crisis in the Kremlin and the next steps, but above all about mobilization, how Russians are reacting to it. And I'd love to do very soon a long and proper Q&A where I honor and put on the screen your questions. But this is going to be an oft repeated question blitz, where I'm just going to read questions out and answer them. Arkady Ostrovsky has tweeted, it seems that the referenda only makes sense if Putin is prepared to use nuclear weapons or chemical weapons. Could you comment on this tweet by Arkady Ostrovsky? Ostrovsky runs the Russian coverage at The Economist, and I recommend The Economist as, on the whole, the most reliable English language coverage of Russia by a major journalistic institution. I'm afraid I'm sympathetic to this worry. I think, and it's astonishing that we have to say this, because it's a catastrophic collapse of public service responsibility. You attack genocidally a neighboring country, you kill tens and hundreds of thousands of people. How can your public service responsibility go any lower? Oh, of course it can, by putting the world on the precipice of a nuclear crisis. That's worse, because you're talking about not just one country, but all countries being impacted by that potentially. So absolutely repulsively, in the context of any kind of public service ethics, like more repulsive than the most repulsive things we typically talk about. So repulsively, Putin is reserving for himself the space, the room, to act on the nuclear option if he so chooses to do so in the future. Which is to say, if you put these bits of Ukraine and say that they're Russian now, nobody will accept that. Ukraine will still keep advancing if it can. But if you put them inside Russian territory, using nuclear weapons when what's at stake is Russian territory is much easier for Putin in the context of what the machinery of the regime will allow him to do. It's much harder for Putin to feel that he has got the nuclear option there if it's a nuclear option that's really connected with Russia losing territory that's formerly part of Ukraine. With territory that Russia claims as part of Russia, Putin's capacity to reserve extra room for a nuclear option increases. And that's partly what's involved with the referendum. And that's just the floor. It's the bottom, pretty much, when it comes to an absolutely nihilistic disintegration of any sense of public office responsibility. How total or partial is the mobilization? It's neither. It's as much as they can do, and they might have a break and then do more. So don't pay too much attention to designated groups, designated numbers, hidden aims, public aims. No, they're going to try to catch who they can, and then they're going to reassess. So it's just them having a go at mobilization. And if they feel it's not enough, they're going to sort of huff and puff and try harder and do more. That's basically it. Is it dangerous for Putin to give weapons out to so many people? Yeah. But he feels it's not an imminent danger, and about that he's probably right, but it might be a danger a year from now if these people come back and Russia is defeated and they are very initiated in using weapons and disillusioned with the Putin regime. What is Putin trying to do now? What is his main aim? His main aim is to see if he can create a division, a divide between the West and Ukraine, such that the West says, let's negotiate, and Ukraine says, no, let's keep pushing Russia back. And he wants to do that by several means, including annexation followed by nuclear blackmail. Do you think mobilization makes Putin's end more or less likely? More likely, easily, which is why he was so resistant to making the move. He is weakening his position in order to potentially create an extra way out for himself. But it's also unclear that that's possible. In other words, he's going to be seen by many experts as digging a bigger hole for himself. But I mean, he is basically in the immediate dynamic of decision making, reacting to the fact that he is vulnerable to the circles around him if he simply continues to lose the war without doing anything about it. Are Russians understanding what is happening to them? That's a question about mobilization. Well, a bit. So, for instance, they are more shocked by mobilization than they are by the war, which is itself a testament on the extraordinary depoliticization and passivity and denial of the Russian population. But I still would say no, they don't get it. And I am not surprised by it, but I'm astonished by it. Because there's so many people now online saying, I'm a student, surely I'm going to be okay. I'm 56, so surely I am going to be okay. I have a medical condition, I have a medical certificate, maybe I can submit it, maybe I can go to these conscription centers, submit my certificate, get some kind of a stamp. And that is eye-wateringly naive, and it's a failure to recognize that effectively men 18 to 60 and some women have lost all rights in Russia. They didn't have many left, but they had some rights about the state taking biological possession of them. And they've now become a kind of resource for mobilization, and they don't get that there is nothing else except that. There's going to be no formal bureaucracy here that'll come to their aid. It doesn't matter what medical condition you have. It doesn't matter whether you're a student. It doesn't matter whether you have medical experience, military experience or not. You're screwed. And they're not getting that. And some people are saying, well, I've got some good excuses here, so I'm going to go to one of these centers and get... No, you're going to be put in a bus. You're going to be taken away. So that naivety is eye-watering. Absolutely eye-watering and breathtaking. What you need to do is not go anywhere near these centers, literally not go anywhere near them. Look at quitting your job. Look at leaving the country. If you can't leave the country, look at changing the city so that your address for conscription is not the same as your physical residential address. That machinery, while it won't allow you any leeway to make legitimate excuses, it is an agricultural machinery, and it's probably going to be possible for most people who are keen to evade it. But you've got to be awake to that, that you're going to be sent to kill innocent people. You have an overwhelmingly high chance of being killed or disabled. Best case scenario, you come back profoundly traumatized. And pretty much nothing is too much as far as things you should do to avoid this. So Russians on the whole not getting this, and the naivety is quite extraordinary. There's almost a feeling there are protections in place which no longer exist. These people have become just material. And it's true of some women too, particularly some women in the medical fields, and they should be careful too. Is it hypocritical of Russians to protest mobilization but not war crimes in Ukraine? Also, Russians have been criticized for protesting for themselves but not for the victims of Ukrainian war crimes. Hypocritical, yeah, but let's basically sort of correct the perspective here. First, the extraordinary passivity of Russians isn't what's stopping them from protesting. Nobody would protest in Russia today. If you put Ukrainians in the place of Russians, they wouldn't protest. You put Americans in the place of Russians, you wouldn't protest. Ukraine's experience of protest is irrelevant to the Russian situation. Ukraine's experience of protest in 2014 occurred at a situation where there was conflict, division, pluralism. You were protesting, there were people on your side inside political institutions. So it's a totally different situation to try to come out against a political regime that is tilting in an authoritarian direction early on, when there is significant conflict, divisiveness, and pluralism. There's going to be lots of parties on your side. Equally, it's possible to come out late on when an authoritarian regime is collapsing. That's what the Belarusians tried to do, and they almost got there. But in the middle, when you're dealing with a dictator, you basically can't do anything. So that's worth emphasizing. There's a kind of a prejudice that people in Western democracies have, and to some degree people in Ukraine have, about what protesting in Russia means. If you're in Russia, statistically, you would not protest, and you're deluded if you think you would. A percentage of people would. That could be you, but we're talking about an infinitesimal percentage of people who are going to go out and do something that is going to have zero practical efficacy, but could ruin their life, put them in jail for 15 years. I mean, when somebody is being taken away by a police officer on the street and you touch the police officer, that's half a decade in jail. So that's important for context. The second thing I think that's really worth saying here is that it's not completely clear that the Russians who've come out in very small numbers against mobilization have come out to save their skin. You're not saving your skin, you're going to prison. Very, very high likelihood. And you are doing something that is an incomparably greater risk to your life than the risk of just trying to avoid you or your loved one being mobilized. So yes, there is a sense in which one's saving one's skin when one's protesting against mobilization, but not against Bucha, let's say. But there's also a sense in which one absolutely isn't, because one is not saving one's own skin. One is profoundly endangering one's own skin. Protesting in Russia is so dangerous that it's 1,000 times a better bet for one's personal, if you like, self-interest to just try to evade mobilization. Several countries aren't letting Russians in who are fleeing mobilization. What's the most just decision? Well, justice isn't necessarily the value that should prevail. Very often other prudential values should prevail. It's very, 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 very difficult for democracies to deal with influxes of people. And it's very difficult for democracies to handle that in a balanced way. And a high degree of populism is often inevitable here. And very often doing something that seems well justified puts at risk the stability of your political system, or allows some ugly forces to come to the fore in your political system. And politicians are often stuck in between. So we've got to appreciate the three-dimensional texture of the Baltic states saying no to Russians who might be wanting to escape conscription. But we've also got to say that this is a complex thing that needs to be properly weighed ethically. And if you're a Baltic state and you're not letting in Russians escaping conscription, are you complicit in a moral crime of considerable magnitude? Yes, there is no question about that. So it's not a fluffy or an innocent decision. You've certainly got blood on your hands, blood in abundance, if you don't let Russians who come in. But it's who want to come in. But it's very politically difficult to do that, and they've got to show a rounded understanding of how delicate this is. But basically, look, somebody's saying, if you don't let me in, I'm going to be forced to go and kill innocent people in Ukraine. So, while there may be a practical and a moral case against letting these people in, there's also a very strong case for letting them in, and we should not allow discourse in these countries on Russia's border to evade the robust criticism that even if there are good reasons for some of the decisions being made, that these are decisions with considerable blood on their hands. And when the response comes back, well, these Russians should just stay in their country and protest the regime, that is just cheap populism, which sometimes is politically inevitable, but it's nothing more than cheap populism. Nobody's going to protest the Putin regime now in Russia. That's just not what humans of any kind would do. How harmful is mobilization for Putin's hold over power? Isn't it a big hit on his popularity? Yes, it's a catastrophic hit on his popularity, potentially. And best case scenario, it's a serious hit on his popularity. What he has as a resource to pressure and hold authority over the people around him is that he can go directly to the people and be recognized as the only political institution with perceived legitimacy. He is the incarnation of political legitimacy in Russia. And if his popularity declines, he becomes much, much, much weaker relative to people around him. And I'm not saying this is imminent, but it certainly makes the odds of him being removed, whatever they presently are, higher. And he is so anxious and reserved about having gone into this decision, precisely because he understands that. There's so much he doesn't understand, but he understands that. Why did Putin trade the Azov fighters for Medvedchuk? Don't Russians see the Azov fighters as neo-Nazis? Well, quite certainly that's the Russian perception. It's an incorrect perception, but in broad brushstrokes. But it could be that Putin just has a personal decision he needs to make there. So it could be that there's a promise there, and that promise is being executed. There could be things I'm not aware of, but if that's the case, and what it shows is that a lot of people who do very terrible things in politics still retain bonds of duty to very narrow circle. So you have politicians like Stalin who are ready to put everything in the mincer, even if it's closest people around. Putin, insofar as he's a political monster, is not one of those monsters who puts everything in the mincer. He just puts most things in the mincer. Are there anything we're not thinking about at the moment that could be discussed that isn't being discussed? Yeah, I think so. And it's going to sound like a generic thing to say, but it's not. Central to why Russia is happy to lower itself into such extraordinary depths of crap and profoundly endanger the world and devastate Ukraine and allow extraordinary darkness to descend within the country, within Russia, is that Russia has an unprocessed relationship with the Soviet crimes, and Russia collectively doesn't understand why we can't do what Stalin did. We'll talk soon again.